Hello, and thank you for joining this webinar on Mediterranean oak borer and other pests of California oaks. My name is Sherry Shook, and I'm an invasive species educator with the UC IPM. This webinar is brought to you by the CalFire UC Cooperative Extension, CalFire, UC Cooperative Extension, and the University of California statewide IPM program. Organizers for this webinar include our speakers, Cooperative Extension Advisors, Joanna Solins and Mackenzie Patton, and various members of the UC IPM staff. We now get to the heart of our presentation. I'm going to turn this over to Mr. Curtis Ewing from CalFire to discuss the Mediterranean oak borer.
Okay, thank you for coming to the webinar this evening. I will be presenting on the Mediterranean oak borer, which is an emerging pest of oak trees in California. And then after that, I will very quickly mention a few other pests. Some of them, two of them are not of oak, but they're also important pests that are emerging in California. I am a member of the entomology and pathology program at CalFire, and we work with all non-federal landowners and managers. So we're constantly getting calls from a tree in somebody's front yard to Sierra Pacific Industries. So the outline is I'm just going to do a quick life cycle of 4 boring beetles that will be covered this evening. So we have 2 invasive ambrosia beetles, the invasive shothole borer and the Mediterranean oak borer. And then we have 2 invasive flathead borers, the emerald ash borer and the gold spotted oak borer. Mike Jones will cover them. Gold spotted oak borer, and each one of these pests could easily take up 1 to 2 hours of seminar time. So I'm going to spend most of my time on the Mediterranean oak borer once I get into the specific species, and then I'll just very quickly give an overview of the invasive shothole borer and the emerald ash borer, and Mike will also cover the control strategies. So invasive boring beetles most commonly disperse through flight as adults, but they can also disperse as larvae, usually in a very late stage, so they don't really have that much more development to do in greenways. So the 2 ambrosia beetles I'm going to talk about are quite closely related and have a similar biology. And the same is true of the 2 flat-headed borers. They're actually in the same genus, but there are actually a few things that they differ in, which do affect the way that they can be detected and controlled. So ambrosia beetles were the Mediterranean oak borer and the invasive shothole borers. There are 3 species so far of the invasive shothole borers that have invaded California, but the Mediterranean oak borer, that's a single species. So in terms of their life cycle, when they leave an infested tree, such as the one at the top, which is becoming quite dry probably and not very good for their ability to raise their young. A female that's almost always mated, it's called a foundress. It will leave and find a new tree. It'll excavate new tunnels, which we call galleries in the tree, and they go into the sapwood mostly. And at the base of their mandibles, they have paired pouches, the little pink picture here, and those hold a symbiotic fungus, which isn't always a pathogen, but in this case, for both of these species, there are fusarium and other species that are wilt fungi. And normally they kind of hang around all winter and then they wait till it gets warm in the spring, usually above 75 or 80 degrees. And so that means that over on the left here in the bottom, you can see through our trapping that they can come out anywhere from the end of May to the end of April, and I mean March, and then this year it looks like they're going to be coming out this week and next week. So it looks like April is the middle of when they normally would come out. And then once they get into the tree, they start laying the eggs. They'll lay eggs from the spring when they attack in March all the way through to the fall. I've observed them laying eggs as late as October. Takes 6 to 8 weeks to become an adult, and there'll be multiple overlapping generations. If the female isn't mated, it can still lay unfertilized eggs, and they will be males. This is the same as like a honeybee. And they actually are social insects, but not at the level of a bee. And then eventually in the fall, you'll have lots and lots of mature females inside the tree. The tree might die at this point, and that is one of the reasons it can disperse, and I'll very easily, and I'll get to that in a little bit. And in fact, that's true of all of these species. Um, so the infested wood is full of females, tens of thousands, possibly even hundreds of thousands at the end of a season. Most of the females have mated prior, as I already stated, and then they can establish. So, flat-headed borers, they overwinter as larvae or pre-pupae. I'll show a picture of that in a minute. Their life cycles can take anywhere from 1 to 2 years. If the eggs are laid late in the season, or if the tree is fairly dry and they can't get very good nutrition, then it'll often take 2 years. And then over winter, they're just sitting around as these pre-pupae. As soon as it gets warm, then they finish, and they don't need to feed anymore. So even if the tree gets cut up, they can move around, it won't hurt them. And then they just finish developing in the spring and then come out a little later, more like June and July. So at the top is one of the larvae. In the middle is the prepupae. It's quite large, over an inch long, and it's folded in half like a little U shape often. And then at the bottom is one of the pupae inside that same chamber where you can see the prepupae. And these guys are just under the bark, where the ambrosia beetles are inside the sapwood. So again, in summer and fall, the infested wood can have late stage larvae, and then they complete the life cycle and disperse. So the bottom line is that all four species can efficiently disperse and cut wood, especially firewood and green waste. So we say, buy it where you burn it, don't move firewood. And if you just can't help yourself, then make sure it's age for at least 2 or 3 years, so that these tree killers are no longer in there. There's one caveat to that, is that if you are in an area with a disease, such as sudden oak death, that can linger in firewood for decades. So this is outside that kind of quarantine area where you're only worried about insects. So the Mediterranean oak borer, MOB, you can see some infested wood here. This was cracked open. It was a dropped limb, and you can see there's many of these beetles. So the females are native to the entire area around the Mediterranean, all the way up into southern Scandinavia, east to Iran, and up into Russia. Again, the mandibular mycangium, they're pretty small, 3.1 millimeters, but they're actually much bigger than the invasive shot-hole borer. The males are flightless. They pretty much never leave the tree, so you almost never see them. So this shows the infestation, the sort of greenish yellow color. That was when we first delimited them in 2021. We estimated they were probably already established for a good 7 to 10 years. That was in 2020, 2021. And then they've been expanding their range ever since then. And in fact, today, over on the right there, I collected some at Folsom Lake just this afternoon. And so they started in Napa County, up in Calistoga, and now they have spread to at least 7 counties. So their favorite hosts are all in the trees in the white oak section. They will not be attacking any of the smaller shrubby ones, because they only attack trees, say 6 or 8 inches. Even parts of the trees need to be 6 or 8 inches. So if they're attacking a branch, it needs to be quite large. They primarily attack valley oak, less common on blue oak, and they've been documented. It took 3 or 4 years of looking, but we found them on Oregon white oak in both Oregon and in Napa. And in both cases, the trees were quite damaged. In Napa by the glass fire, and in Oregon, they were street trees that had sustained damage. So it seems like probably the Oregon oak is not as susceptible, but we're not really certain yet. So symptoms of attack, they usually start from the top down and only on one side of the tree. So here you can see on the left-hand side of this tree, it's quite infested on that left-hand side. They're in the branches and they're all the way down into the bole. On the right-hand side, it looks like the branches in general are doing better, but it looks like it's starting maybe to spread over there. And there are no beetles on the bole except for just a little strip on that left-hand side. There are none on the right-hand side. Often they can be up in the canopy for a good long time, 5 years or more, before they present boll symptoms. So it can be very difficult to diagnose trees that are infested because the tops of the trees tend to be the weakest part of the trees. So basically native and non-native, both pathogens and insects will pretty much all tend to attack the top of the tree first. The most diagnostic symptom are these trellis-like galleries. No other beetles known in California produce this pattern where the beetle bores straight in and then makes a whole bunch of branches going on either side, and it looks kind of like a trellised grapevine. If as the tree declines, this one was probably in its 7th year or more of infestation. You'll start to see boring dust, especially collecting in moss and spider webs on the bark at the base of the tree. And if you hack the bark off, then you can see these galleries inside as little holes. The associated fungus, I won't get into this, but Fusarium and Rafflesia are common wilt fungi. Both the invasive shot-hole borer and the MOB carry these. This is what they eat. The fungus digests the lignin and the other undigestible bits of the wood in there, and then they eat the fungus. So they don't actually eat the tree. Um, so this fungus creates staining, and you can see here on the left, this is part of a longitudinal section where the fungus is moving efficiently up and down the branch. And then on the right is a cross section of a large branch about 18 inches in diameter. And you can see that they've mostly limited their attack to the sapwood, and the sapwood is completely stained with the wilt fungus, which has cut off the water and caused the tree to die. And then just to show you another tree, so up on the right-hand side, this tree was dissected, so we know how this infestation proceeded. It started in that upper right-hand corner, then it just kept moving down. As it moves down, it cuts off the water supply, so it can't really move back up because those branches are too dry to grow their fungus, so they just keep moving down. Eventually, they get all the way down to the main bowl where all the branches meet up, and then they can girdle the tree with that fungus, and then the whole thing just goes brown. Sometimes the tree can look quite healthy, maybe just a little bit of leaf loss and maybe a couple twigs have fallen off, and then they get down into that bowl, and then it seems to just die very suddenly in just a few weeks. But the beetles have been in there quite a while. And then this is a tree those other trees were in Napa. This one is in Sacramento, and it seems like some of these trees in Sacramento, maybe because it's so much warmer, can just have massive infestations in the boles of the tree and just produce massive amounts of the boring dust, this light colored powder that you can see all over this tree. At the same time that the beetles are in there, there's also often carpenter ants because oak trees almost always have heart rot in the branches or the bole, and the ants get in there. So the MOB is a very, very fine powder, mostly light colored. You can get a little bit of darker color. And the carpenter ants. Oh, and it's also very uniform because each little piece was nipped off with their mandibles, and they tend to be very, very similar, just a couple hundred microns, and just they vary by maybe 20 or 30 microns. So they're very similar. Carpenter ants are just ripping off bits of wet, rotten wood. So they'll be all different sizes. from quite large, they could be a centimeter long all the way down to a few millimeters. In this case, in the same tree, I was digging around just inside that boring dust, and I did find a dead one, and then 3 or 4 live ones popped out. So you don't even need to hack around necessarily. If you see a lot of dust like that, you can just kind of take your finger, move around through it. It can be 2 or 3 inches deep, and you should be able to find dead or alive beetles in there. Okay, so invasive shot-hole borers and fusarium dieback, same sort of thing. These guys burrow into the sapwood, and on the right-hand side, each one of those little brown spots is an attack. So this tree, which is a plane tree or a sycamore, has hundreds, if not thousands, of these individual attacks on this one tree. Originally, there were 2 species discovered, one from Taiwan, one from Southeast Asia, maybe the area around Vietnam. They're so similar that they're almost impossible to tell apart. You would have to make slides and look at them at about 1000x to be able to tell them apart without DNA. Each one has its own fusarium that it uses to choke the tree off. And then in October of last year, another species was discovered. It's much bigger. We're calling it the greater shot-hole borer. This one probably came from somewhere in the southeast, though it could have come from Hawaii or possibly from Asia, but probably from Alabama or Florida, somewhere in that area. So that is just in the Felton region, which is just up above Santa Cruz, and we're starting to monitor this one as well. So right now, that little red circle sort of up to the top toward the left, that's that larger, greater shot-hole borer that we just discovered. And then the blue ones are one of the small species. That one, we discovered it had jumped up into San Jose about a year ago, and it is quite well established, especially along Coyote Creek and a few of the other creeks. And this year we're going to be monitoring all the adjacent counties and up in Sacramento, because there's a lot of really good habitat in Sacramento. And then the other species was in San Diego. So 2 separate introductions, one into Long Beach, the Polyphagous shot-hole borer, and then the other one into San Diego, the Carruccio shot-hole borer. Um, Unlike the Mediterranean oak borer, which attacks just 2 or 3 species, the invasive shot-hole borers have 65 reproductive hosts, which means they can grow their fungus in there. They can build their tunnels and raise young. They actually attack probably close to 200 trees, but they don't necessarily affect them very much. And then on the right-hand side are the 15 species that are the most heavily attacked. And you can see there are 2 oaks, Valley oak and English oak, in that list. And they really, just like the Mediterranean oak borer, of all the oaks, they love the Valley oak. They really heavily attack Valley oak. And let's see. And they also like species that grow along streams. So the box elder is probably its favorite. And then they also really like street trees, like the California plantain. And unfortunately, the and then California sycamore and the London plane, and then there are other species in that group that they will also attack. And so those are where it's usually detected in a new habitat is actually on the plane trees. So it didn't show up, but there was a little graph that's supposed to be here that shows that a single fertile female can theoretically, for the invasive shot-hole borer, because they can finish a life cycle in just 3 weeks, 4 weeks if the temperatures are high, and they can go from one female to probably around 1 million if the tree is a good habitat for them. So they're probably, each generation, well, each female is able to raise, say, 5 to 10 young. They would easily hit 1 million in a single tree in just 1 year. Oh, there it is. Sorry. So you can see, and this is actually very conservative, just 5 daughters survival, 10 to 20. Survival is typically quite a bit higher than that. So it only takes 6 generations at that. And if it was higher, you could probably get there in 4 or 5 generations. The emerald ash borer is another pest that we are very worried about. We started monitoring for it in collaboration with the Department of Agriculture at all the border crossings and up and down the main entries into California from the north. So it was established and discovered in 2002 in the East Coast, but what we're interested is the blue and purple spot off to the left around Portland, Oregon. So it was originally discovered in 2022, 2023. It hadn't really spread yet, but in 2024, it had spread to 3 adjacent counties. This is typical of its spread. And it is spreading down the I-5 corridor, and obviously I-5 splits off to Route 1 and Route 101 around Medford. So we're especially worried about those two routes, and we're concentrating our trapping in those areas. And this genus has over 100 species that are native to California, and they're all around the same size. They look vaguely similar. So this invasive one might be a little difficult to tell, and some of them are vaguely metallic green or blue. But under the wings, this one is a bright orangey at the base. If you kind of look there, sort of toward where the wings are attaching, those wing covers, you can see that bit's a little orangey. And then as you go toward the tip, it gets darker. So some are kind of orange for the whole way. Some are red the whole way or orange at the base, or they can even be like this one, quite purple. But the other species would just be kind of a duller color under the wing covers. So they can be a little difficult to identify because they also, like the Mediterranean oak borer, they attack at the top of the tree. We have to set our monitoring traps at a minimum of 25 feet up in the trees. They will attack all ash species, though they prefer green and black. But once they're done killing all those, they'll just move on to all the others. But unlike most pests, they don't seem to care how big the tree is. Usually, and especially in Agrylus, they'll subdivide the habitat. So one species will attack smaller branches, another one will attack medium-sized branches, and another one will attack the bole of the tree, like a big diameter 12 plus inches. But in this case, they'll just go from 3 inches or even as small as 1 inch all the way up to a full-size tree, multiple feet in diameter. And they'll kill pretty much any tree. So that was it. I'm back to the beginning.
Thank you, Curtis, for that great presentation. There's a lot of information for all of us to take in. At this time, we're going to hear from our UC Forestry Advisor, Mike Jones, and he'll be speaking about other pests of California oak trees. Mike, you go ahead. He is ready to go.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, good evening, everyone. Thanks for being with us tonight. So my name is Michael Jones. I am the University of California Cooperative Extension Forest Advisor for Mendocino Lake and Sonoma counties. I'm an entomologist by training, and I specialize in forest health and disturbance ecology. So working with forest landowners on stewardship, but I work a lot with Curtis and other forest health specialists and on tree pests and diseases. So I'm going to cover really where this part of the talk comes from is Curtis and I are the lead kind of in the Mediterranean oak borer research and outreach efforts. And we get a lot of questions about and concerns about trees. And so where these pests really come from are things that we've been asked about, whether or not it's mob. We've gone and looked and kind of identified other, what I would consider more common native and sometimes more established invasive species in oaks. And so we're just going to talk about some of those pests because, they may present similar signs and symptoms as mob does. And so we just want to kind of identify some of those common issues that we're seeing. All right. Okay. So before I move on to these other pests and some diseases, I just want to wrap up with Curtis saying about mob management or control. And because this is a relatively new invasive species, at least a new detection, we're still in the early stages of understanding really the ecology, the biology, everything about this pest. So as far as management, we don't have a lot of information. We're still in that research phase and still building some of those resources. So a lot of the effort right now is on monitoring. So Curtis, a lot of the research and a lot of the information Curtis has is from trapping and delimitation efforts. we were trying and still are kind of thinking about how can we do remote sensing to detect mob infestations. Very challenging in the forest health space, but still a potentially tool. And the kind of the take home for mob right now is we're still not entirely sure what kind of pest that will be. Is it going to be something that's really aggressive and kill healthy trees? Or is it acting like a secondary pest like native insects where it's taking advantage of heavily stressed trees? And so really at this point, what we're suggesting is that really improving the vigor of trees is crucial in kind of helping to manage for mob and kind of prevent either rapid rates of spread or to manage, the rate of mortality. So I know this is a hard thing, especially in the urban forest and the WUI, is that improving tree vigor can be challenging because there's a lot of stressors in these spaces, but thinking about supplemental watering when that's appropriate and if it's appropriate, adding mulches and other things to help maintain soil moisture, and then reducing competition and potentially sanitation pruning. But really that's our focus, is we're not so much thinking about other options right now as opposed to, hey, can we make these trees stronger and more resilient to potential mob infestations? Obviously, as we all know in this space, that moving infested material is a big challenge with invasive species and certainly is a large factor in the kind of rapid spread of mob in Northern California. For mechanical treatments, we know because of research on the invasive shot hole borers that the best tool for ambrosia beetles and small bark beetles in trees is to destroy the material. So other than improving vigor, when you do have infested material, mechanical treatments such as chipping and burning are really effective. Obviously, you destroy the insect, you reduce its potential to spread and infest new trees. We don't know if sanitation pruning is going to be effective. We can see mob and signs of the infestation, but how far into the xylem has its symbiotic fungi spread? And can we get ahead of it? And we're not really sure yet if that is going to be effective. But if we are pruning for sanitation, really pruning back aggressively to maybe the next branch node or attachment point below where there's decline is going to be best practice. Solarization is no longer recommended just because it's complicated, costly, and not very effective. And then we're just now really thinking about chemical control, and we don't really have any information on this right now. We do suspect, based on invasive shot hole borers, that it'll likely be a cocktail of a fungicide and insecticide, and we're just beginning to really research these questions. So keep your ears open as we kind of dive into this research into the future. All right, so let's talk about the pests. And like I said, these are going to be both native and invasives and might have similar symptoms to mob, but let's talk about some of those differences. So just to recap, right, the signs of a mob infestation are pretty classic forest health challenges in oak woodlands and really common across all forest types and tree pests. Is the first thing that we notice is tree decline. That's nothing special. Lots of things cause tree decline. So that by itself is not necessarily a good indication. Maybe as we get better identifying mob, there might be patterns in that canopy decline, or we can look for other features, but at that first recognition of something's happening in the tree, it's not, just a guaranteed identification from canopy decline. Next, we see boring dust on the main stem, and there's lots of things that feed on the main stems of trees, or that will cause boring dust, other insects that attack oaks. So again, that doesn't necessarily guarantee a mob infestation, neither does the presence of staining. These are very common symptoms that we see a lot of other pests. And then lastly, this is where we really start to hammer in, like, oh yeah, we can confirm mob based on collecting adults from the tree and from looking at galleries, the kind of the feeding structures. But again, this requires destructive sampling of a tree or trying to identify galleries from broken branches and other kind of material that's dropped from a tree. So it's not always readily available or easy to see it, or you have to destructively sample a tree, not necessarily always something that a landowner or a land steward is going to want to do. So really, thinking to more passive ways, signs and symptoms of canopy decline and boring dust and exit holes aren't necessarily just guaranteed mob infestation, right? And there's lots of things that will cause that, lots of things that cause interesting canopy decline patterns. And then there's hundreds and if not thousands of insects that feed on oaks and hardwoods in different capacities, whether it's defoliators or wood borers. So, this can be a lot of a challenging space to identify a pest just observationally, right? Okay, so what the most common insect that we get questions about are, a mob suspect tree. and we go out and look, is typically Western oak bark beetle. So this is a native insect. They're really cute, tiny little bark beetles, true bark beetles. Well, Pseudopithiopterus, and that's a mouthful, right? And they are really like drought-stressed trees. So typically when we have periods of drought, you'll see Western oak bark beetle, or we call it WOB, because we like acronyms in entomology, will pop up and cause little clusters of tree mortality. So it attacks many oak species, and the way I have these outlined is how do we identify it, and then what are kind of the management strategies. So mob itself is not a serious pest, but certainly can be, confused for Western oak, for Mediterranean oak borer. The tricky thing about Western oak bark beetle is that it now is vectoring an invasive disease called foamy bark canker. And so maybe some of you all seen this. It's literally called foamy bark canker because where the beetle enters the tree, as the female colonizes the tree, her entry hole infects the tree with this geosmithia, and that causes this really unique pitching pattern where it looks like foam, the sap kind of foams out of these exit holes. So it's very obvious when you see foamy bark canker in Western oak bark beetle infested trees. And as you can see, everywhere on the tree where a beetle tries to colonize or successfully colonize, she initiates an infestation, or a kind of a canker. So that's really commonly confused for looking for mob infested trees. Again, if you look at the host range for Western oak bark beetle, it's across all oaks. Foamy bark canker is really in kind of the red group, so not necessarily something we'll see on Mediterranean oak borer preferred tree hosts. So the white section of oaks. Right, thinking about flagging in the canopy, causing discoloration, either necrosis, chlorosis, some of these major symptoms we see. We can have things like oak branch dieback. So these are pathogens, Diplodia species. They occur in the larger branches, so we get large areas of flagging or specific areas of decline in the tree. A wide variety of hosts, including across the red and white sections of oak. So certainly could be something that we see in mob infested trees as well. And I think what you'll see commonly with a lot of these pests and diseases I'm talking about, aside from the invasive ones and Mediterranean oak borer, is that typically they're not serious to the threats to the health of the tree, right? They may be aesthetically damaging, and potentially after years of drought, you may see potential decline or even mortality. But for the most part, these things kind of just kill a couple branches or cause some decline. And then when we get good precipitation again, or a little bit of more favorable weather, we see that the issues usually kind of go away for periods of time. So they're not necessarily serious management challenges. Oak twig blight, right? Thinking about the oak branch cankers kind of affecting large areas of branch. I think we've all seen the twig blight where it just like clusters the foliage at the tips of the leaves. This is certainly in this photo a very extreme example of an infested tree or an infected tree. But little clumps of foliage die because the twigs get infected with a cryptocline or discula, and causes this dieback. But I don't know, there's very few oaks I see that don't have this, especially in the live oaks, and those trees are just fine. Again, it occurs across a lot of the different oak species, including those that are hosts for Mediterranean oak borer. Again, not a serious forest health problem in that these trees usually recover or can persist through this kind of disease. I notice I include fungicide on here. I just want to make note that, it is potentially treatment, right? It is a fungus infecting these trees. That's certainly a recommendation from a while ago, not necessarily sure that the potential, side effects of treating a tree, the entire canopy of a large tree is necessarily worth it when this kind of thing can usually go away on its own. And also you'll notice a lot of the time that the particular diseases I'm talking about and some of the pests are related to having warm, wet springs, right? So when we have more, just like this spring, when we have moisture and it's warm, that's perfect conditions for sporulation and the spread of diseases and pathogens. And sometimes we see an uptick in these, the appearance of these particular issues, especially when we have like a dry summer, and it just kind of increases stress. So we see this kind of additive disturbance where it causes these outbreaks that noticeably occur and for periods of time. But it doesn't necessarily mean that there's kind of a bad outcome. It just means that there's some stress occurring, and we'll keep our eye on it. Armillaria, I think most of us are familiar with the armillaria root disease, oak root rots. Armillaria is the genus. It's multiple species in California, a wide host range, loves oaks, but also spreads to conifers and other hardwoods. Really common in the pests in the urban areas. Typically when you armillate, it was armillaria because your tree fell over in a wind event or with saturated soils, because the pathogen eats all the roots and it just kind of structurally fails. Or you see fruiting bodies or the reproductive structures or just the growth, the mycelium and the rhizomorphs. So yeah, this is also something we get a lot of questions about, and people are like, hey, is this mob? But this is really kind of something completely different. And the big space for this is, and the challenge, I think the reason why I include armillaria is if drought stress is a precursor or could potentially create stress that makes trees more susceptible to mob, then maybe irrigation is a potential option. But if we irrigate at the wrong time of year or in the wrong way, we can exacerbate issues like armillaria and cause potential tree decline and mortality regardless. So really thinking about the existing native or the endemic diseases and pests in the space while also managing for mob is really crucial. Sun oak death. Now we're getting kind of, this is an example of an invasive species. Well established in California across the entire range. It's in Del Norte now, and so we have a continuous range of infestation from up in Oregon down through California. There's 3 strains that we know of at least, and so everybody hold on to their hats. This could potentially kick back up with this new EU1 strain showing up in California. A wide range of hosts that get the blight, but it only kills a handful of true oak species. They're all in the red section or intermediate section. So again, we're not going to see sod infestation overlapping with Mediterranean oak borer infested trees. But if we're in a space where we're thinking about how do we manage for forest health, oak health issues, and maybe we don't white oaks, we don't want to replant or manage for white oaks because of Mediterranean oak borer, but then we have other issues with the red oaks. How do we think about long-term stewardship in that space? And so it's important to pay attention to what's happening to the other oak species in potentially mob infested areas. Yeah, lots of information. I'm not going to go into this, but the sunoakdeath.org website, really good information on managing for sod and dealing with sod. I'm sure a lot of folks have been kind of working in this space for a while. But again, like Curtis mentioned, a lot of the same lines is not moving infested material, thinking about mechanical control and managing species or individuals that could be super spreaders or heavily infested is still really important for, just like with mob and other native endemic species. These are all the same kind of considerations for management. This is, I'm only highlighting a handful of potential pests and diseases, right? Like I said, there's thousands. And a lot of times when we do see big upticks in damage, it's usually because they're defoliators or they cause canopy decline. So common one that we see are things like oakworm, which is a defoliator, twig girdlers, which cause canopy dieback, and tent caterpillars and pit scales, which also cause foliage decline. So there's just tons of things going on in this space. What triggers a release or the outbreak to occur at what scales, it's highly variable, and our oaks are really good at resisting pests and diseases. So a lot of the times these things may appear as significant challenges, and maybe in the urban space they can be, but for the most part, the trees will recover with good environmental conditions and good stewardship. Sometimes we see fun things, and the landowners weren't really excited about this, but I sure did. I got excited when I saw it, and this was in Sonoma County. We see here, these are live oak, coast live oak, in the middle of winter. So that's really was surprising. It was really wet out, and we started to see really rapid decline of entire canopies all at once. Turned out to be a 2-horned oak gall wasp outbreak. They're really cool. They're called 2-horned oak gall wasps because the galls have these 2 little horns on them. They infest the veins of the leaves, causing rapid chlorosis and kind of sucking the nutrients out of the leaves. And it looked like these trees were going to die, but they just got 100% defoliated, and sure enough, they were fine the next year. And these 2-horned oak gall wasp populations collapsed, and I have no idea what happened to them. I was trying to follow them, but they just disappeared. So we could get fun, I guess maybe if they're your trees, it's not necessarily fun, but it was certainly very interesting to look at and study kind of while they were around. Oak galls, everybody, I'm sure we're familiar with oak galls, but I get these questions, are they bad? Well, they're not really bad. They're just kind of symbiotic. With the oaks, they're these little snippets for the most part, these little tiny bitty wasps. And they're really cool because you can identify the species of the wasp based on the shape of the gall and the host tree that it's on. And so they're just kind of fun parts of the ecosystem. Could be unsightly, again, an aesthetic issue, but not necessarily a forest health challenge. Acorn pests, while not necessarily causing defoliation, right, or decline the way we think about it, when you get damaged acorns, you can get, for example, drippy nut, which is a bacterial infection in acorns that have been infected with filbert worm or filbert weevil. And so you can get basically what looks like honeydew, but it's much larger, sappy deposits under trees, and can be cause for concern as well. So things to be thinking about, not just necessarily what's feeding on the foliage or the stems of the tree, but maybe the fruit or other parts of the tree. Mistletoe, I get a lot of, we get a lot of concern about this. Is it killing my tree? And typically, by the time we see mistletoe, the tree's a very large, potentially decadent specimen. It's not necessarily a killing tree. Certainly is a hemiparasite, can in fact impact health during long periods of drought. But again, it's just kind of part of the ecosystem, not necessarily a bad thing. Not much you can do about it other than pruning it out. Also think that in sometimes thinking in the urban space that we can plant less or more resistant species. And then also prescribed fire on the landscape is really important for controlling the abundance and occurrence of really heavily mistletoe infected oak trees. Sometimes it's really as simple as just storm damage, right? Somebody's like, hey, what's wrong with my tree? And I was like, well, what's wrong with my tree? And I'm like, well, did it snow or did we have rain or wind and it's broken branches? That can be as simple as just branches breaking. It can be effects to the roots, right? We think, I saw this tree within a mob infested area. I was like, oh, there's no way that tree doesn't have mob. Got out and took a look at it. And sure enough, you look at this construction behind it. This is, I don't know if the house was new, but the slab next to it was. So they basically just girdled the entire half of the root system of this tree, and it just, it killed the tree essentially. So sometimes it's not even pests and diseases, it's human activity that can cause significant stress and potentially create pathways for other insects and diseases, but certainly the main mechanism of damage is kind of what the disturbance from humans in that space. And then lastly, trees get old. They don't necessarily have a termination gene, but demographic or environmental stressors persistently kind of putting pressure on these trees eventually weaken them and they start to die back. And that's just part of a normal process of the tree's life cycle, and not always something to be concerned about, but that we have to pay attention to, right? And we may look at these branches at the top of the tree and be concerned, or we may just recognize, hey, this is an old tree that is going to die and we need to think about what do we replace it in the space with. We talked about shot hole borers. I mentioned this again, and Curtis went a good detail. Is it's basically a cousin. I don't know, that's not the right analogy, but they're like cousins to Mediterranean oak borer, and they have very similar symptoms, but they have a much wider host range. So definitely be paying attention to when you're looking at mob, what kind of symptoms are, or what kind of species the tree is, and are the symptoms similar? And that's going to be really important, right? This is especially with mob in Northern California now. We really should be looking out across most of the urban species in our urban forests, thinking about what are the symptoms? Do they look like mob or shot hole borer? Right, that's going to be unfortunately something that we're all going to be thinking about long term now. Gold spotted oak borer, didn't go into too much detail on this. We talked about bupressids like emerald ash borer. Similar, it's in Southern California. It likes the red oaks again, so coast live oak, California black oak. So there's not going to be much overlap with mob. But again, it has the potential to spread throughout California. And the big one here is if you look at the signs and symptoms of gold spotted oak borer, it's really the D-shaped exit hole. That's kind of this classic characteristic detection for bupressids is a D-shaped exit hole. And you start seeing red oaks in your area that have these D-shaped exit holes. That's something to be concerned about. So again, paying attention to the species and the signs and symptoms. Same for invasive species, same kinds of management practices, right? The detection, delimitation, cultural practices of not moving firewood, and chemical controls as potential options, but really being better stewards. I think, I just touched on a lot of the pests and diseases of oaks. A really great resource in this space is a field guide to insects and diseases of California oaks. This is a free publication online. Just do a Google search or email me. It is just really comprehensive. We're working on updating it, as well as the California Oak Disease and Arthropod Database. This is maintained by the folks at Phytosphere, so Ted and Elizabeth. We're updating that resource as well. And then for more detailed information, we have a website for MOB PC, which is the Mediterranean Oak Borer Pest Complex.org. There's also a website for invasive shot hole borers, and that covers, the Kurosawa and Polyphagus and the new species as well. And then for more information on general about oak stewardship, you can check out the website UC Oaks, which is maintained all of the information and even new information from the Integrated Range Hardwood Management Program through UC A&R. And then, of course, the sponsors of this program as well as the UC IPM has really great resources on tree pests and really good information on oak stewardship as well. So with that, I think we have time for questions and whatnot, but appreciate you all for your time. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike. That was an excellent presentation.